Good evening. This is income taxation that will cover the topic of allowable deductions. So this is lecture 5 of our subject for this trimester. So in this particular topic, I will explain in detail what do we mean by allowable deductions. Because when this word deduction, when it comes to accounting, we refer to the business expenses. It is called allowable deductions in taxation because it is allowed by the BIR to be deducted from the gross income to arrive at the taxable net income. So the BIR again allowed these expenses as deductions from gross income to arrive at the taxable net income. So let's define itemized deduction. It is an expenditure on eligible products, services, or contributions that can be subtracted from the adjusted gross income to reduce tax liability. As I have said, deductions or itemized deductions are the expenditures. These are eligible expenditures related to the business. It is called itemized because these deductions or expenses are itemized or enumerated in the income statement of an entity. So these are the expenses itemized or enumerated, subtracted from the adjusted gross income. The objective actually is to reduce the tax liability. So in accounting, deductions are known as operating expenses. As I have said, when we say allowable deductions from gross income, this relates to business expenses. In other words, if the expenses are not closely related or directly related to the business, that will not be allowed by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. So expenses which are personal to the business owners and does not contribute to earning the income are not allowable deductions. Example, I put up a sole proprietorship business. So, of course, I have so many business-related expenses. But if my personal expenses are included in my business expenses, that expense of mine used for my personal reason will not be allowed by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Example, me and my family went out for dinner in a restaurant. The amount that we spent in that restaurant dinner with my family is considered my personal expense. I am not supposed to include that expense in my business expenses. So that is what we meant, expenses which are personal to the business owner, that is personal to me. And in that case, if that expense will be find out by the BIR, if that expense was detected by the BIR to be my personal expense, that expense will not be allowed. That expense will not be deducted from my gross income. Taxpayers not engaged in trade or business or practice of profession are not entitled to deduct allowable deductions. In my case, I am an employee of LCUP. I receive my salary. That salary is my income. That is considered my net income. For tax purposes, I am not supposed or I am not allowed to deduct my personal expenses from my salary in order for me to reduce my tax liability. I am not allowed by the Bureau of Internal Revenue to deduct my personal expenses because I am not engaged in trade or business or practice of my profession. So here are the examples of business expenses which are allowed as deduction from gross income by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Take note, these expenses are examples only. Actually, there are so many business expenses allowed by BIR. I am just citing the most common example of business expenses allowed to be deducted by the BIR from the revenue of the business to reduce the net income and also to reduce the tax liability. The number one example is salaries expense. Everybody knows that if you are maintaining a business, you have to hire people that will help you in operating your business. So it is only logical to include salaries expenses as one of our allowable deduction because the Bureau of Internal Revenue knew that salaries are essential in business operation, meaning you cannot operate without your people. You have to pay your employees so that your business will run. The second example is office supplies. Office supplies is needed in business operations because we have to do some documentation. Most of the time, we have to prepare letters. We have to prepare correspondence. We have to print some reports. We have to print some email messages. We need the ink for our printer. We need bond papers. We need ball pens, pencils, fastener, our staple wire. We cannot avoid office supplies when it comes to business operations. That is why the Bureau of Internal Revenue allowed office supplies as long as it is related to the business. The number 3 example that I cited is advertising. If you entered into a business, whether if you want to promote your business, your product, you have to spend in advertising. The purpose, of course, is to introduce your product or your business to the public. Thereby, you want to increase your sales. That is why advertising is related to the business. When you spend certain amount of money to advertising, that may increase your sales revenue. Therefore, advertising is allowable as a business expense. It is allowed by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. The fourth example that I cited is about communication. We need to communicate to our clients. We need to communicate to government regulators. We need to communicate to our creditors, to our suppliers. We need to communicate with our depository banks. So, we cannot avoid communication expense. So, in accounting, communication expense refers to the amount of money you spend in the telephone bills, internet, sending mails, and other communication-related expenses. So, communication expense is allowable deduction for tax purposes. Next, insurance. In business, you operate your business using machines, using equipment, using transport vehicles. By this means, you want to prevent possible risk in case of machine breakdown. So, by this means, you will insure your machines, your equipment, and your transport vehicles so that whatever happened to these machines and equipment and vehicles, the insurance company will answer for the expenses brought about by damages. So insurance actually is related to business because you have to insure your assets. By insuring your assets, you expect something in the future. If something bad happened to your asset, the insurance company will answer for the reimbursement of expenses. So insurance is necessity in business operations. That is why the Bureau of Internal Revenue allowed insurance as one of the deductions from gross income. The next example is depreciation expense. I hope you have finished your fundamentals of accounting and you are already familiar with depreciation expense. Depreciation came from the root word depreciate, meaning the value diminishes. When you purchase an asset, example, you acquired a machine worth 500,000 pesos and the estimated useful life of that machine is 10 years. You will divide 500,000 pesos by 10 years. The result is 50,000 pesos. That 50,000 pesos is your annual depreciation expense. And that depreciation expense is allowed by BIR to be one of your deductions or expenses. Next, bad debts or doubtful accounts. When you have accounts receivable in your business, always expect you have bad debts or doubtful accounts. Example, you sold merchandise on account. When you sold merchandise on account, you delivered the goods to the customer, but the customer did not pay you. The customer will pay you not today but in the future. The customer gave you a promise to pay. Therefore, you will have a receivable from the customers. But in reality, we cannot avoid some instances that the customers may default in payment. When you say default in payment, that means the customer will not fail to pay in time, or the customer did not pay at all. In that case, you will provide an allowance for bad debts or allowance for doubtful accounts. It is called bad debts because the indebtedness of the customer to you became bad. He is not paying on time. It is also called doubtful accounts because you are doubtful as far as collectibility of accounts receivable is concerned. Actually, the bad debts or doubtful accounts expense is based on estimate, based on previous experience. If you have previous experience about certain clients who are not paying their indebtedness to you on time, that will be included in your estimate. Therefore, that estimated bad debts or doubtful accounts expense will be included as part of your deductible expenses for tax purposes. Next, when we say our allowable business expenses, this means that these expenses are necessary for the business to generate income. When you spend something, always expect something in return. If you spend a certain amount of money for the training of your employees, what is your expectation? You expect that your employees will be competent enough to deliver what you want them to do. If you spend a certain amount of money for advertising, what is your expectation? You expect that the sales would increase because your product became popular or became known to the public. So that is what we meant by this sentence, by this statement, that allowable business expenses are necessary for the business to generate income. Therefore, if your business expenses is not used to generate income, that business expenses may not be related to your business. And the Bureau of Internal Revenue is very conscious and crucial. They are very interested on the nature of your expenses, so that the business expenses will be determined to be closely related to your business. If your expenses are not really related to your business, that will not be allowed. That will be disallowed by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. So let's explain these expenses. Salaries paid to employees are necessary because the business will not operate without the people behind it. This is the one that I discussed a while ago. You paid your employees, you pay them salaries so that they can work efficiently and effectively. If you will not pay them on time, what will be your expectation? You cannot expect productivity from your employees if they are not paid properly. Therefore, salaries are necessary for the business to generate income, because the employees are the ones generating income for the company. Therefore, salaries paid to employees are allowable, deductible expense. Next, advertising is needed so that the product will be known to the public, thus increasing sales. So when you spend something in advertising, the expectation is that your sales would increase. So, advertising is necessary for the business to generate income. That is why advertising is allowable expense as prescribed by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Next, we cannot do away with OPI supplies because these are needed for documentation of business activities. As I have said a while ago, we have to document our activities by using OPI supplies. We have to print the emails, we have to prepare letters, communications, we have to print them, we have to prepare contracts, and the contracts will be printed for signature purposes. So we really need office supplies. We need ink for the printer. We need a staple wire, thumbtacks. We need paper clips. Those are the small things to be used in the business, but necessary for the business to generate income. That is why the Bureau of Internal Revenue allowed office supplies as one of the deductible expenses. We need to communicate every now and then to clients, suppliers, and government regulators. That is why we spend a lot of money for communication. As I have said, when you say communication, we are referring to the amount paid for telephone bills, for the internet, for sending mails, stamps used for sending mails. So all of these fall under communication expenses. Communication expenses are necessary for the business to generate income. So, this is the exception to the rule. What is the general rule? The general rule is that only expenses related to the business are allowable deductions. I will repeat. The general rule is that only expenses related to the business are allowed as deduction for tax purposes. But here is the exception. What is the exception to the rule? Let's see what is the exception. Some expenses are allowed as deductible expense despite the absence of a business relation. So, these expenses are allowed by the Bureau of Internal Revenue to be part of the deductions from gross income even though it is not related to the business, and the example is donations made to charities which is not related to business operations. Try to think of this exception to the rule. Donations to charities. Everybody knows that when you make donations to charitable institutions, it is not related to your business. But why is the Bureau of Internal Revenue allowing donations to charities as deductions from gross income to reduce the net income and to reduce the tax liability? What is the logic behind why the BIR allowed this kind of expenses as an exception to the rule? So let's see. So the logic behind why donations to charities is allowed as deduction is that the government is just promoting the concern and love for humanity. Since time immemorial, the government is promoting concern for the people. So if your company donated something to charity, there is a presumption that your company is concerned with the welfare of the people. Your company has that display of love and affection for humanity. That is the first reason or logic behind why the government allowed donations to charities as deductible expense, because your company is showing utmost concern and love for humanity. Next, another reason, the company taxpayer exerted effort and go into extra mile just to help other people. So the company really exerted more effort. There is an extra effort and go into extra mile to donate a certain amount of money to charities just to help other people. So the company spend extra time just to help other people. And this is the second reason or logic why the BIR allowed donations to charities as a deductible expense. Next, let's proceed to the BIR ruling on charitable contributions as allowable deductions. So, again, this is an exception to the rule. What is the general rule? The general rule is that only expenses related to business are allowed as deductions for tax purposes. That is the general rule. The exception to the rule is that donations made to charities or charitable contributions, although not related to the business, are allowed as deductions for tax purposes. Because of this, the BIR set rules in order to avoid abuse of this privilege given to the business entities. The business entities are given this privilege to include charitable contributions as allowable deductions. And in order to avoid that privilege given to them, the BIR set this ruling on charitable contributions. So under the rules, deductions for charitable contributions could be deducted in full or under limitations. So we have two. We have two ruling as far as charitable contributions are concerned. The first ruling is that the contribution is deductible in full. The number two ruling is that the charitable contributions has some limitations. So below are the charitable contributions which are deductible in full. Let's see what are these contributions which will be considered deductible in full. When we say deductible in full, the amount that you donated, the full amount or 100% of the amount that you donated will be considered allowable deduction. If you donated 1 million pesos to charities, that 1 million pesos is considered 100% deductible. And these are the contributions that are deductible in full. The first one, deductions to BIR Accredited Institutions properly documented with certificate of donations and other papers. What do you mean by BIR Accredited Institutions? This means the foundation or the charitable institution is accredited or recognized by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. So if you are a company donated to a charitable institution accredited by the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the amount that you donated is 100% allowable deduction, provided you will document it properly by means of certificate of donations and other papers. So that is the first ruling as far as charitable contributions which are considered deductible in full or 100% deductible. Again, if you are a company donated to a charitable institution and that charitable institution is accredited by BIR, the amount of your donation is 100% deductible. Next, donations to government priority projects certified by the National Economic Development Authority. Your company donated to government for their projects, and that project is a priority by the government as certified by NEDA. If you donated 1 million to the government for their priority project, that donation is 100% deductible. Example, there is one project today that is being prioritized by the government, that is the Balik Probinsya project. If you will donate to this project, to this Balik Probinsya project by the government, this is a priority project. The amount that you donated has no limit. It is 100% allowable as deduction. If you donated 1 million pesos to this project of the government, the whole 1 million pesos will be allowed as deduction. I think this is very clear to everybody. Next. So what is the logic? You may notice I always discussing the logic behind every concept that we discuss. So we are discussing BIR ruling on charitable contributions which are considered 100% allowable. So what is the logic behind? The logic is that the two charitable contributions mentioned in the previous slide are fully deductible because the amounts given to them would benefit the entire nation. If you donated to a priority project by the government, my example is the Balik Probinsya project. That Balik Probinsya project will benefit the whole nation because the whole Metro Manila will be decongested. Many people will go back to their province. They will be given opportunity in their respective provinces, and that project will decongest the whole Metro Manila and it will ease the traffic situation. So that project would benefit the entire nation. That is why if you give donations to a government priority project, that is 100% allowable as deduction. Next, these donations have an impact on the upliftment of the lives of the beneficiaries. If you give donations to the Balik Provincia project of the government, what will be the effect? The lives of the people, not only in Metro Manila, but those staying in the provinces, will be uplifted. You just imagine if all cities throughout the Philippines will be considered like Makati and Manila, there will also be some opportunities in those provinces. So, by this time, many people in Metro Manila will go back to their respective provinces because they will be given equal opportunity regardless of the location. So, these donations created heavy impact on the upliftment of the lives of the Filipino people. That is why donations to government priority projects are considered 100% allowable deductions. The donations contribute to economic development. It is very logical to think that this project of the government will contribute to economic development because the concentration is not only in Metro Manila but throughout the government, throughout the country. Usually, the amount of contribution is substantial and would take extra willingness on the part of the owners of the company making the donation. Whenever you make donations to BIR Accredited Charitable Institutions, whenever you make donations to government priority projects, usually the amount is substantial. I encountered one instance during the Ondoy typhoon. I think that was in 2009. BDO Universal Bank, the largest bank in the country, donated 10 million pesos for the typhoon victims. You just imagine, 10 million pesos is not a joke. So that means the owners of the company exerted willingness. There is an extra willingness to donate to the victims of the Typhoon Ondoy. That is why this kind of donation is considered 100% allowable deduction for tax purposes. Let's continue with the BIR ruling. So, deductible charitable contributions of taxpayers, corporate and individual, shall not exceed the following rates based on their respective taxable income before such charitable contributions. So, this is now the limitation. What we have discussed in the previous slides is about donations to charities which are considered 100% allowable deduction. But in this particular slide, we will discuss charitable contributions with limitations, and it will depend on the percentage provided by the law. So these are the limitations. But before we proceed, what do you mean by based on their respective taxable income? So the amount of percentage will be multiplied by the taxable income of the company making the donations. Taxable income before deducting these donations. So, we will first, in this case, we will first compute for the net income, and whatever is the percentage of limitation, we will multiply that percentage to the net income before deducting these charitable contributions. So, let's discuss the limitations. The first one, if you are an individual taxpayers, you are given a limit of 10% of your taxable income. Example, you have a taxable income of 1,600,000 pesos. What is the 10% of 1,600,000 pesos? The 10% is 160,000. If you donated to charities, if you donated to charitable institutions, not accredited by BIR, if you donated to government projects, but the project is not a priority project, example, you made a donation of 300,000 pesos, the 300,000 pesos will not be allowed as deduction. Only the 10% of your taxable income is the allowable deduction. In my example a while ago, if you have a taxable net income of 1,600,000 multiplied by 10%, the limit of your allowable deduction for this charitable contributions is only 160,000 pesos, not 300,000 pesos. I think that is very clear. This is the first limitation for individual income taxpayers. Next limitation is about the corporate income taxpayers, and the limitation is 5% of taxable income. So, if you made a donation of large amount of money, you have some limitations as far as allowing the charitable contributions as deduction for tax purposes. The limit is 5% of your taxable income. So, you may notice under this ruling, the limit actually is lower than the actual donations. This is to avoid abuse of this privilege granted by the law to some individuals and corporations making charitable contributions. So obviously, you may notice the rate for the corporate taxpayer is lower than the individual taxpayer, because in the Philippines, corporations are the ones normally used for big-time operations. Usually, if you will compare the net income of a corporation to an individual, the net income of the corporation is way ahead. It is much bigger than the net income of an individual taxpayer. That is why the percentage of limitation is lower as compared to individual taxpayers, because corporations are used for big-time operations. Let's continue with the BIR ruling. So, in claiming the deductions for charitable contributions, taxpayers should see to it that it is properly documented in accordance with the rules. When you say documented, when you make a donation to a charitable institution, always ask for an official receipt or acknowledgement receipt as an evidence that they receive the amount of money that you donated to them. That is what we meant by documentation. It would be better if you have pictures of your action giving donations to charitable institutions. So, because the Bureau of Internal Revenue is always looking for supporting documents for the charitable contributions that you made. So, documented means, as I have said, the donation or contributions should be supported by official receipts or maybe an acknowledgement receipt if they don't have official receipt yet, issued by the recipient or the charitable institutions. I am sure all charitable institutions are also required by the Bureau of Internal Revenue to issue official receipts, even though they are non-stock, non-profit corporations. They are also required to issue official receipt. So, if you donated to them, always ask for an official receipt. It would be better if the action is supported by certification or pictures highlighting the activity. So, aside from the official receipt, the charitable institution must issue a certification that the company, the donor, really donated this amount to them. Or pictures. There is no intention, there is no bad intention why some people are taking pictures while making donation. The objective actually is to document the actions, the donation, so that the BIR will allow the donations as deductions from gross income. I will repeat, when you see somebody taking pictures, making donations, don't be judgmental that they have hidden motive for that making donations. They are doing these things so that the BIR will allow the donation as deductions from their gross income. This is taking pictures is part of BIR documentation. So in order to understand these problems, this BIR ruling that we are discussing, we must have some illustrative problem. Because whenever I discuss the theory, whenever I discuss the concept, whenever I discuss the law, the taxation law, the BIR ruling, I always supported them with illustrative problem. And this is the problem that I prepared that will reflect charitable contributions as allowable deductions for tax purposes. So let's discuss this problem. This is about Nikki Corporation. The following data were taken from the books of Nikki Corporation as of December 31, 2020. I hope you understand the terminologies here because I presume that all of you have finished fundamentals of accounting, because taxation is a close relative of accounting. You cannot understand taxation if you know nothing about accounting. So I presume that the terminologies being used here are familiar to you as financial management measures. So, the first item is sales. When you sold merchandise on account, we call it sales. If you are engaged in the buying and selling of merchandise, whenever you sell goods to your customers, it is called sales. So in this case, the sales of Nikki Corporation is 7,500,000. And then we have here the cost of sales. What do we mean by cost of sales? This is the the cost of the merchandise that you sold to the customers. Meaning to say, the sales of 7,500,000 is the selling price, while the cost of those merchandise that you sold is called cost of sales. It is the amount of the merchandise that you sold without markup, while the sales of 7,500,000 is the amount of the same merchandise that you sold with markup. So the cost of sales here is 3,230,000 pesos, and the operating expenses, which are allowable deductions, is 2,670,000. When we say operating expenses, we are referring to the examples that I mentioned in my previous slides: salaries expense, advertising expense, OPI supplies, communication expense, depreciation expense, doubtful accounts expense, and all other operating expenses. So these are all called operating expenses, and these are allowed by the BIR as deductions from gross income. So here are now the donations. Donations to the construction of public hospitals in Negros Occidental, which was prioritized by the national government. Take note, prioritized by the national government. And the amount of donation is 750,000 pesos. So take note of this. This donation is a priority project. These donations pertains to the priority project of the government. What is the ruling of the BIR? If you make donation to the project which is considered priority by the government, the whole amount of your donation shall be allowed as deduction, 100% allowable deduction. So the whole amount of 750,000 in this case is allowed as 100% deduction. So next, you also make another donation. Donations made to Lingap Pangkabataan Incorporated. Lingap Pangkabataan is a non-stock, non-profit corporations. So, you make a donation to them. The amount of donation is 300,000 pesos. The question is Lingap Pangkabataan accredited by the Bureau of Internal Revenue? Because if Lingap Pangkabataan Incorporated is accredited, the whole amount of 300,000 pesos shall be considered as allowable deductions. Let's see if Lingap Pangkabataan is accredited by BIR. So here we can see that Lingap Pangkabataan Incorporated is not accredited by BIR. Therefore, the amount of 300,000 pesos is not deductible, not wholly deductible. There are some limitations as far as this donation is concerned. So we have 3 questions to solve this problem. The first question is, how much is the net income of Nikki Corporation before deducting the donations? How to compute the net income? Sales, less cost of sales, less operating expenses. That is your net income. Question number 2. How much is the total allowable donations or charitable contributions? Here, we will apply the BIR ruling that we discussed a while ago. We will now apply the limitations that we mentioned if the donations was made to non-accredited charitable institutions. Question number 3. How much is the taxable net income after deducting the donations? So you have your net income after deducting operating expenses, and then you will again deduct the donations allowed by the Bureau of Internal Revenue to arrive at the taxable net income. So here is now the solution. We will now apply the BIR ruling in this particular solution. So the first question is, how much is the net income of Nikki Corporation before deducting the donations? So let's compute. The first item that we will consider, of course, is sales. We are just like preparing income statement. So how much is the sales given in the problem? The amount of sales given in the problem is 7,500,000 pesos. And then we will deduct the cost of sales. As I have said, the cost of sales is the amount of merchandise that you sold without markup. So in this case, the cost of sales given in the problem is 3,230,000 pesos. That will be deducted from the sales of 7,500,000 pesos to arrive at the gross profit of 4,270,000 pesos. And then from that gross profit, we will deduct the operating expenses of how much? So the operating expenses given in this problem is 2,670,000, and that amount will be deducted from 4,270,000 pesos. So the net income before deducting the donation is how much? 1,600,000 pesos. So this is the answer to question number 1. How much is the net income of Nikki Corporation before deducting the donations? I hope this is very clear to everybody. Question number 2. How much is the total allowable deductions or charitable contributions? So we will now apply the BIR ruling as far as limitations of charitable contributions are concerned. So the first donation that you made to the construction of public hospitals, which is a government priority project, is 750,000 pesos. What can you notice? The whole amount is deductible because this is a government priority project. What is the second donation? The second donation is the one that you donated to Lingap Pangkabataan Incorporated. And according to the problem, Lingap Pangkabataan is not accredited by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. So let's compute for the limit of charitable contributions for Lingap Pangkabataan Incorporated. Actually, the actual amount that we donated is 300,000 pesos to Lingap Pangkabataan Incorporated. but that amount is not allowed as full deduction by the BIR because Lingap Pangkabataan is not accredited. So how are we going to compute for the amount of allowable deductions for donations to Lingap Pangkabataan? So let's compute. Can you still remember the net income that we computed in the previous slide? The amount of net income that we computed in the previous slide is 1,600,000. According to the BIR ruling, the limitation is 5% of net income before donation. Therefore, to compute for the donations to Lingap Pangkabataan, which is the limitation, that is 5%, multiplied by 1,600,000 pesos, the allowable deduction as far as donations to Lingap Pangkabataan Incorporated is 80,000 only. You just imagine, the actual donation is 300,000 pesos. And since Lingap Pangkabataan is not accredited by BIR, the allowable deduction is only 5% of our net income as we computed in the previous slide. So the donations allowed for Lingap Pangkabataan as deduction is 80,000 only, as compared, there is a big difference as compared to the actual donation of 300,000. So we will include donations made to Lingap Pangkabataan Incorporated. How much? 800,000 pesos. Therefore, the total allowable donations or charitable contributions is 830,000 pesos. So, this is the answer to question number 2, wherein we computed for the limit of donations to Lingap Pangkabataan Incorporated. The allowable deduction is 80,000 only because according to the ruling, only 5% of the net income is allowed if the institution is not accredited by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Let's proceed to the last question. Question number 3. How much is the taxable net income after deducting the donations? Here we can see how our net income was reduced because of these donations. So the net income that we computed before donations, the net income that we computed in the previous slides, last 2 slides, is 1,600,000 pesos. That is sales, less cost of sales, less operating expenses. And then, we will now deduct the total allowable contributions that we computed under item number 2. How much is that? That is 830,000 pesos. That 830,000 pesos is 750,000 pesos donated to government priority projects plus 80,000 pesos allowable deductions for Lingap Pangkabataan Incorporated. So if we will deduct 830,000 from 1,600,000 pesos, the taxable net income of this corporation is reduced to 770,000 pesos. So just imagine the difference. If there is no donation, our tax will be 30% multiplied by 1,600,000 pesos. Whereas, because of these donations, our net income was reduced to 770,000 pesos. Therefore, the tax that we are going to pay is 30% of 770,000 pesos. So you can see the reduction in net income, in taxable net income, because of these donations. What is the logic why donations are allowed even though this is not a business-related expenses? Because the government encourages everybody to exercise their social responsibility in helping other people. So here we can see the impact of contributions to charity when it comes to tax benefit. There is a big impact of that contributions or donations to charity as far as the tax due is concerned. The tax due will be substantially reduced because of these donations deducted from net income. I hope everything is very clear. I hope you learned something from this lecture number 5 about income taxation that covers donations to charitable institutions, otherwise known as contributions to charities. Thank you very much and keep safe, everybody.